Ever get that feeling like when you're watching something behind the scenes
Yeah.
and you just can't shake the thought that it's not really behind the scenes anymore?
Yeah.
Especially with something like Formula One, right?
Yeah.
It's so huge, so public, it's all over the place. And that's kind of where my head's at as we jump into this deep dive on the latest season, season 7 of Drive to Survive.
It's funny because when a documentary series gets as big as this one has, like, it can't help but change the very thing it's trying to show,
Right.
It's not just a passive observer anymore. It's like part of the story.
Totally. And I think what's really cool about this deep dive specifically is we've got this whole mix of reactions to sift through. We get Jeremy Clarkson, who, never holds back.
Right.
He's got a lot to say about it, and he's spent years around cars and cameras. Then we've got The View from the show's executive producer.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the most important part, what the actual fans are saying.
So we're basically trying to figure out, for everyone listening, does this latest season of Drive to Survive actually give us that real behind-the-scenes look at F1 anymore?
Yeah.
Or has it morphed into something different? And how are different people, feeling about that potential shift?
Okay, let's start with Clarkson, because he's always good for a strong opinion. He seems to be saying that the raw, the off-the-cuff stuff you might have seen in earlier seasons, that's fading away. What's the heart of his argument here?
I think Clarkson's main point, and it's a pretty insightful one, is that because everyone's so aware of the cameras now, it changes how they interact. Like what might have been a genuine, heated moment or just a natural reaction. Now it's almost like they're playing it up for the camera. It's all PR.
Yeah, he even uses this really basic example, right? Max Verstappen just casually mentioning the rain. And even that, according to Clarkson, sounds kind of staged.
Exactly. He uses that super polite, almost boring comment about the track being slippery as like proof.
Yeah.
The proof that the drivers are thinking differently now. They know those cameras are there, so they're super careful about how they come across, what they say, and it's a far cry from those what do you call them? Hissed altercations, he remembers from the earlier seasons. Back then, maybe they didn't quite realize how much those microphones were picking up.
It makes you wonder, right? Like that early stage where maybe everyone was a little less guarded. Maybe that's when they caught some real gold. And then there's his take on Aston Martin, right? They're barely in this season, and he's actually happy about it. That's kind of an interesting angle.
Yeah, it is. And for Clarkson, the fact that Aston Martin's basically missing just proves his point that F1 drivers need to keep some of that mystery, that mystique. He thinks that too much exposure kind of ruins it. Like we, the viewers, we don't need to know everything about their lives when they're not racing.
He even says it straight out, right? I actually don't want to know what they're doing after the race or where they go on holiday or whether they prefer biscuits to cheese. Like that really sums up his old school view,
Yeah.
He wants these drivers to be these larger than life figures.
Exactly. And he sees this constant access, this feeling that we're always with them, what shows like Drive to Survive kind of encourage as taking away from that mystique. He'd rather we just focus on what they do on the track, keep that sense of something special.
So let's switch gears now. Let's hear from the guy actually making the show, right? Executive producer Tom Hutchings. He says they're focusing on the best human stories, the ones that will really hit home with viewers, pack a bigger punch, as he puts it. That sounds pretty different from just filming whatever happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a very deliberate choice. What Hutchings is saying is they're being more selective now. They're looking for those narratives that have real emotional depth, stuff that will resonate with a wider audience, and maybe even people who aren't already huge F1 fans, right? The key takeaway here, I think, is that they're moving away from just giving us raw access. They want to craft these really emotionally powerful stories, for maximum impact.
So less about being a fly on the wall in the garage and more about really shaping the narrative for the season, picking out specific people, specific events, and highlighting those.
Exactly. They're looking for those moments that tell a story, moments that reveal something about the drivers, the teams, who they are as people, even if those moments aren't, these big spontaneous outbursts.
Okay, and how about the viewers themselves? We've got some feedback from Rotten Tomatoes, and it's actually pretty positive, especially considering what Clarkson's saying. That's kind of surprising.
It is, yeah. I mean, one viewer, Doriam, they even call this season the best one. They like that it focuses on the top teams, the big storylines, and doesn't get bogged down in the, the smaller stuff. Which, if you think about it, really fits with what the executive producer was saying about those impactful narratives. It's like, some viewers actually prefer a more streamlined approach, a highlights reel.
So for Dory M, less is more, maybe. And then we have Jack B, who says the season returned to form.
Mhm.
They think it did a good job capturing the important stories from the last F1 season, but they also mentioned that maybe they're avoiding some of the more highly controversial stuff.
Yeah.
That brings up a good point, right?
Right.
What are they choosing to show and what are they leaving out?
Yeah, Jack B's comment makes you wonder, like, how much access do they really have? And how are they editing things? Because if they're leaving out some of the more controversial parts, maybe Clarkson's onto something about this whole PR management thing. Are they purposely downplaying certain stories to protect people's reputations, to maintain a certain image?
And Esteban C., they said they enjoyed the season because it was like a good recap of all the important stuff that happened in the 2024 season. They liked that it gave them insight into, the dynamics between the drivers and the teams. And they wished they'd included some other stuff, but they said it was helpful because it reminded them of what a crazy F1 season it was. So for Esteban C., it sounds like Drive to Survive is almost like a season recap with some extra, behind-the-scenes stuff sprinkled in.
Yeah, I think what Esteban C is saying is that Drive to Survive has this other purpose too. It's like a really accessible, entertaining way to catch up on the season, especially for people who maybe don't watch every race weekend. They don't follow it super closely. It gives them this structured way to understand all the big events, the rivalries, and the fact that it helped them remember, like, the craziness of that season. It means they did a good job hitting the main points. So for some people, the value is in that well-produced summary.
So we're seeing these different expectations, right?
Yeah.
Clarkson wants those raw, unscripted moments. He misses that old mystique around the drivers. The executive producer is going for these big human interest stories. And a lot of fans seem to like this well-produced recap, something that focuses on the main drama, the top teams. It makes you think, like, what is this show really trying to be? What's its main purpose?
Exactly. For someone like Clarkson, who's been around F1 forever, the value is in those little moments, those real unguarded glimpses behind the curtain. But for newer fans, or even older fans who just like a good story, the focus on the big storylines, the drama, that might be way more appealing. It's like, what does behind the scenes even mean anymore?
Right.
It depends on who you ask.
And this shift that Clarkson's talking about, this move towards a more PR-controlled environment, that's probably happening for a few reasons, right?
Yeah.
The show is so popular now. Everyone's watching. The drivers, the teams, they're under all these contracts. And the teams themselves, they're way more strategic about how they manage their image.
Absolutely. Formula One is so high stakes. It's competitive. It's a business. And the teams, the drivers, they're really aware of how they're perceived globally. And a platform like Netflix, that just takes it to another level.
Right.
So it makes sense that everyone would be a bit more cautious, a bit more controlled about what they show. Because, when everyone's watching those unguarded moments, they become a bigger risk.
So the big question then is, if it's becoming more curated, is it still behind the scenes? Like, what does that even mean now? Does it mean we get unfiltered access? Or does it mean we get a really well-crafted story that helps us understand what happened, who these people are, even if they're giving us a more polished version of themselves?
Yeah, that's the core of it, isn't it?
Right.
For some people, behind the scenes means we see everything, warts and all. But for others, it's about getting those real insights, understanding those key moments, the rivalries, the human side of it all, even if it's presented in a carefully edited way. It's almost like the definition itself is changing as the show gets bigger.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really looked at these different opinions about this latest season of Drive to Survive, right? We've got people who want those raw, unscripted moments. They want to keep that mystique around the drivers. Then we have the producers who are trying to create these powerful stories that will connect with a wider audience. And then overall, the fans seem pretty happy. They like this well-produced recap of all the big drama.
Exactly. And I think it just shows you how complex this all is, reality, storytelling, and what the audience expects from a documentary, especially when you're dealing with something like F1, where image is so important.
So here's something for everyone listening to think about. We've heard all these different viewpoints, right? People wanting that raw authenticity, others liking a more curated approach. What do you think the balance should be? What's more important to you as a viewer? And maybe even think about this. How does this whole thing, this tension between real access and, image management, how does that play out in other documentaries in other fields? Because now everyone knows the cameras are always there.
Something to think about.
Definitely.